This video is made possible by our sponsors, AJA. We'd like to thank AJA for all their support and tell you to go to aja.com for all your production and post-production needs. Hi, I'm Gordon Burkell from Filmmaker U. At Filmmaker U, we create courses for film professionals to deepen and diversify existing skill set. You can learn more at filmmakeru.com, or of course, follow us on Instagram at filmmaker_u. Each week, we interview a film professional to discuss their work, and this week I'm joined by costume designer Dajia Milan, whose work includes The Atlantic City Story, Flatbush Misdemeanors, and more recently, Insidious, The Red Door, just to name a few. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
I guess my first question is, how did you get involved with Insidious, The Red Door?
Typical, just interviewed and got the job, just as simple as that.
Okay. So when you're working on in a horror film, how did you approach sort of how each of the main characters would look? And also, like, how do you approach, I guess, ghouls and ghosts when you're designing for them?
So for me, because I was already a fan of the franchise, I knew this story. And The Red Door takes place after 1 and 2.
Mhm.
So it's building those characters was just as simple as making my own world, because it takes place 10 years from 1 and 2, that I had the space to jumpstart a new backstory for them, because it's been such a long time span. So the thought process was just giving them new backstories and just working it out with Patrick, the director, who's also played in it as Josh still. We just worked out what we felt made sense for the characters, for the overall storytelling. And that's basically just how I approached it for just those main characters. And as far as the ghouls, we wanted to create a new space with them, because me and Patrick joked about always seeing like Victorian ghosts and ghouls. And so I came up with a concept of just like, can we do different ghouls from different time periods, because that's something we haven't seen in this franchise at all. And, it kind of stuck, and we just played around with it and it worked.
What's interesting about that is I think about, because we're so used to Victorian ghouls and ghosts.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, I guess, what would you say is inherently scary within their costumes that you were able to sort of pull or utilize in more modern costumes?
I think the state of the world and the state of something being so close to your real life is more terrifying than something that you've never experienced ever. Mm-hmm. I thought that was just a great way of really drawing the audience within the film, just placing themselves in those situations, because it's such a real phenomenon that could particularly happen to people that we know countless times all over the internet and media, that people do have paranormal experiences. So just placing people in those moments was my point of why we wanted to make them more modern than just sticking to the typical Victorian era. And it's just something new we wanted to just bring to the audience.
I got into sound designing at a point when things were just developing. I was really fascinated by the idea that dialogue, effects, and music were all components of the soundtrack to a film, which had never occurred to me before. What gets me excited is coming up with sound ideas that do match picture, but also is not just the equivalent of what you're seeing on screen. I'm Eugene Garrity, and this is my course on sound design.
So in terms of, when we think of the ghosts, there's a lot of practical effects as well as digital effects. So did you work with the effects team to sort of make sure that the clothes sort of were utilized in a particular way, or did you have to help them in the VFX end?
Absolutely. I mean, we had a lot of different elements. Some that didn't make it to camera because, things just change all the time. And we wanted to keep it as practical as possible instead of relying so heavily on technology. So I think it's just important for humans to just do their jobs and try to just make things as easy as possible sometimes. So we worked very closely with the smallest things that we needed to, because there were things where we needed to pad and fake a couple things, do our little movie magic, and just pretty much, not have to work so closely with technology for us.
So what kind of how did, when the actors came in and started testing the costumes and doing fittings and what have you, how did they impact the look of the costumes for you?
So for me, when we started fittings, before we even jump into those sessions, I kind of like to talk my cast through the concepts to see what they will feel most comfortable in and their movements and how they feel the characters will work out. And so I share a lot of my boards, my inspiration with cast, and we kind of talk it through. And then, I kind of get in their heads of like what they might want to do within their body movements. So that kind of allows me to know, they might need to be fully covered because there's going to be some crazy stunts. There will be padding that needs to go underneath. Or, there was a moment where part of the costume and later influenced one of the horror scenes. Dalton's rope belt was actually never scripted in the beginning for him to take it off and to use it to choke Chris. And so a lot of things just plays together, and how the actors will use their costume to later do what they need to do.
So one of the things I'd be interested to know is, a lot of horror movies or scary movies tend to have very low lighting and are darker. So how did you work with the color choices and textures and what have you to sort of make sure that the costumes stood out in that situation?
Yeah, that element was very important to me because as a horror fan, I never see what people are wearing because it's always so dark. And you kind of want to be able to tell the story, especially in those scenes. Still, you still want to see the movement of what's happening and in a way that you see it, but also is scared at the same time. So that was part of the challenge because this was my first horror film to design. And with that, I was able to work very closely with the production designer, director, and the cinematographer to kind of understand what lighting and sequences will take place. That way I can pretty much play around with the textures and the colors that we can actually see. And it'll have these layers and dimensions between the characters and the set design itself.
Oh, interesting. What would you say is your favorite piece from this film?
Oh man. I'm gonna go with Chris's wardrobe, her look at the frat party house, that very funky print top with the pattern shorts was probably the best thing because I'm just such a big fan of mixing patterns and textures and colors. And when I can do it all at once and it doesn't look so off the walls, it's always fun to see that.
Amazing. So when you approach a project, like how do you get into the headspace of the director? Like how do you like to work with them to sort of figure out what they're looking for?
So I had a very long conversation with Patrick in the very beginning when I was initially deciding what I visually saw for these characters, and then having that space to build these new characters was great. Patrick really allowed me to, do my job and just present things that he didn't think of that kind of worked with the backstories that we would kind of put together. And so I think it's really great when a director and a designer can work that closely and just, have that safe space to let's just create and see what we come up with, rather than having to diminish or, kind of take away what a designer could bring to the table themselves, and ultimately what just one person's vision is. I think it's very great to just have a collaborative experience. And I got to play dress up most of the time. So it was really, really fun to do that.
Is there because you said originally that you were a fan of the series. So are you a fan of horror in general, or is it just sorry?
Of horror itself. Like, I love horror movies.
So is there a particular because horror movies tend to have lots of sequels.
Yes.
So is there a particular series that you would love to be a part of?
I think we've seen so many that I would have loved to do, like Halloween, like all the big classics that I grew up on were something that I would have loved to work on, because Halloween's been going on since the 80s.
Yeah, 70s.
Right, 76.
Yeah.
I believe it came out 1976. So I don't think those are gonna happen. I think there will be more newer versions of horror coming out.
Yeah.
And explore, because we've seen, the classics just kind of play itself out. And I think now they're kind of like closing the doors on those. I would have loved to do maybe a Candyman. I know
that would be awesome.
I know. I wouldn't mind a Candyman series of just like from when Danny Robitaille's story just starts, and they start the story from there. They've already done Chucky, so I think they've just been doing a lot of the classes that I would have loved to done already. But we'll see. You never know what the stories bring.
Yeah, you never know with Hollywood. It could
Yes.
green lights on. So I guess my last question for you is, what would you say is your favorite guilty pleasure film or TV show to watch?
I'm going to say I am a teenage adult, because a guilty pleasure of mine, I still watch cartoons.
I do too. So
people give me a lot of slack for it, but it's like, it really just puts my mind in this whole fantastical, whimsical, wild imagination state. And I kind of get a lot of different weird ideas from watching cartoons. My favorite might be like American Dad or Rick and Morty and Bob's Burgers. So
yes, all the classics.
Yes.
Is there a classic or an older cartoon that you love from when you were a child?
Oh, yes. So I'm such a big animal lover. So I still, to this day, I think I just watched it like a couple weeks ago. The Wild Thornberries.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah. That's my guilty pleasure.
Thank you so much for letting me interview you today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And that's it for this week, everyone. Make sure to check us out at filmmakeru.com, and of course, follow us on Instagram at filmmaker_you. I'm Gordon Burkell. Thanks for watching. This video is made possible by our sponsors, AJA. We'd like to thank AJA for all their support and tell you to go to aja.com for all your production and post-production needs.